This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. A quick reminder that we have a live show coming up on September 13th in Boston, so if you want to join us, please come on out and say hello. The tickets are available right now on our website, thisdaypod.com. But today's topic, this day, September 1st, 1901, new Vice President Theodore Roosevelt is giving remarks at the Minnesota State Fair and includes this line. A good many of you are probably acquainted with the old proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far. As best we can tell, he had used that phrase for the first time a year earlier as governor of New York in a letter to a political ally, but now he was trotting it out to a larger audience. And then 4 days after that speech, President McKinley was shot by an assassin, soon after died, and Teddy Roosevelt became president of the United States, and that catchphrase would come to be really associated with him, and in part because it did seem to really capture his approach to diplomacy, especially foreign diplomacy. So let's talk about the origins of that speak softly and carry a big stick line, how Teddy Roosevelt embodied it, what it really means, and maybe we can get into a few other political cliches or famous presidential quotes as well. So here, as always, to discuss, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley, who will not be speaking softly on this podcast because that's bad radio, right?
We do both have big sticks for some reason. Yeah. I don't know if we're like worried about wolves or something, but hi, Jody.
Hey there.
I'm really fascinated by how this quote has been tied to Roosevelt and what it means and been interpreted and misinterpreted. Do we want to do anything more on the kind of like actual quote itself and how Roosevelt started to get it out into the ether?
I mean, I think the quote itself is kind of interesting. It's sort of adjacent to "Don't start none, won't be none."
Yeah,
because it's like, it's saying like, I'm not looking for a fight. I'm not walking around here like shouting loudly, trying to provoke people. I'm mild mannered, but if you push me, I've got a very big stick. So I have this like backbone of steel. So we can have a nice, pleasant conversation, or we could do something else, and I'm prepared for both.
Yeah. I kind of interpreted it as the same way. It's almost like a low-key threat, I would say. You know, like, I'm not intending to be harmful, but I can be if I need to be, that kind of thing. And it sort of bodes well in the moment that you think of this sort of like turn of the 20th or start of the 20th century American imperialism. You think of the timing and the way that the United States has relationships with other countries around the world. It very much does feel like a threat.
The rest of the world certainly came to understand the big shift of American imperialism. The quote itself, before we get into that sort of use of it and how it embodies Roosevelt's diplomacy. So a couple things about the quote that jump out to me. So I mentioned that he'd used it in a letter the year before, and I went down this whole rabbit hole, but it was like a very sort of interscene New York state government politics moment where his opponents were trying to get him to promote someone who he didn't want to promote, and he stood up to them, and then he was writing a letter saying, like, I'm really glad I sort of took a stand here. And in this letter to his friend, he says, it reminds me of this West African proverb that I love. Speak softly and carry a big stick. And then it goes on. But before we get into what the longer quote is, do we buy that this is some West African? How does a West African proverb make its way in 1900 to the governor of New York?
I'm not buying it. I was like, what? I'm like, it takes a village to raise a child, maybe something like that. I've never heard of that before at all. And I feel like it's antithetical to a lot of African communities as well.
It reminds me of those like pretty racist like Confucius say things that people would do where they're just like attribute it to a West African proverb or to Confucius or something like that, where it's just meant to tap into this like naturalized wisdom of people who they see as less civilized but more connected to the earth. And so it has that kind of vibe to it.
Yeah.
Folk wisdom, which, I get why he might want to do that, and that might be effective in certain circles. But I'm also like, is the audience at the Minnesota State Fair, are they going to be won over in 1901 by something you couch as a West African proverb? I don't know.
No.
So it's just an interesting way that he continues to frame it. But then there is a longer version of the quote that he does refer to at one point, and it goes, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far." And then the quote continues, "If a man continually blusters, if he lacks civility, a big stick will not save him from trouble, and neither will speaking softly avail, if back of the softness there does not lie strength, power." I'm really glad they shortened it because I got so confused reading that so many times. I'm like, that's not a very good proverb.
No, it's not.
But, And it reminds me of when we did our episode on the history of Make America Great Again and all the various little tweaks and so forth. And then, I think Trump rightly just sort of found the catchiest, most powerful version of that. But here, I'm glad that it was not like, "Neither will speaking softly avail if back of the softness does there not lie strength and power." Not as...
No.
It doesn't roll off the tongue.
No.
It does not roll off the tongue.
And it's a little confusing, too.
Yeah. So... let's continue to interpret this and then maybe talk a little bit about how Roosevelt used it. I mean, I don't know. It's one of those aphorisms that feels like pretty self-evident to me, and I kind of tend to like the spirit of it, I suppose, though there is that implied threat at the heart of it.
So it's one of those things, like when you say speak softly and carry a big stick, it could be like, I don't know, from a farmer's almanac or Chicken Soup for the Soul. It just has that kind of like a pat life advice feel to it. But when it gets applied to U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy, I mean, I think that's why it has so much stickiness, because it's trying to orient the U.S. to the world and to couch the way the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world in terms of like, we are over here minding our own business. This was the whole idea of the Monroe Doctrine, and Roosevelt's foreign policy was like, we get the Western Hemisphere. And if you don't come over to the Western Hemisphere starting problems, do what you want. Laissez-faire, that's your business. You come over here, then we're going to have a problem. And so speak softly and carry a big stick kind of captures that for U.S. relations with the non-Western Hemisphere. When it comes to the Western Hemisphere, there was no soft speaking. There was only big stick.
I was just about to say, when I think of, the U.S. occupation of Haiti and things of that nature, the Philippines and other places around the world, especially in the West Indies, none of that. It's no one speaking softly, and the big stick is definitely there. The might of the military is definitely there. And I think it in some ways, it creates this narrative around America, though, as being sort of this like, if you cross me, I will cut you. And it creates fear, I think, in other countries, especially that don't have the resources to meet stick for stick. It becomes a real issue.
Yeah, I mean, you think about, Nicaragua and the Philippines, and they probably don't care that the U.S. spoke softly.
Yeah,
right? They just cared about the imperial. But, Kellie, you're so right about the kind of story that the U.S. is telling about itself and the rest of the world in this era, which is not, we're a sort of brazen imperialist power. And maybe the way that, like, previous colonial powers would kind of own that project. And I think the U.S. has always tried to sort of hide that sort of brazen imperialism, but still take on many of the same actions. And I think this sort of encompasses that. We're not going to be out there telling the world that we're a colonial power trying to take everything over. We're just going to kind of use the stick.
Yeah. Quietly.
And we should talk about what that stick is, because this was referring to a very specific type of American strength, and that was building up the U.S. Navy. This was 100% the project of Theodore Roosevelt. He believed that if the U.S. had a strong, powerful Navy, not only could it defend itself, but it could go toe-to-toe with any other major world power. And the U.S. does sort of build its naval power pretty rapidly at the beginning of the 20th century. It moves from like the 5th largest to the 3rd largest navy in the world, and is seen as a sea power, in the early 20th century because of this project.
Yeah, I mean, Roosevelt has, 16 battleships all around the world. That's unprecedented. And when you see those ships roll up to your coast, you really don't have to say anything. It's evident in the presence alone that they mean business.
Yeah. There is currently actually the aircraft carrier, the USS Teddy Roosevelt, is known as the Big Stick now. We'll talk, let's maybe talk a little bit about the legacy of this line somewhat. So, I feel like I heard this along with like the buck stops here and a couple other lines as one of the sort of go-to political cliches. And I think it's also, it escapes politics, right? I think it's a useful kind of like approach. And so I think like, Jack Welch probably used this at some point. Like business leaders, probably employ this line. I think it's a sort of become a leadership cliche as well. It does get name checked in politics a lot. So Romney and McCain used it to criticize Obama. They also used that sort of leading from behind charge. But McCain in 2008 in a debate with Obama, he says, my hero is a guy named Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt used to say, and then he kind of fumbles it. He goes, Teddy Roosevelt used to say, talk softly, but carry a big stick. I like walk softly, too.
I know.
Like sneak up on people and then hit them over the head.
That's right. I think it's also interesting that it's being used more in that period, like 2008, 2012, because it is a way of saying we need a big, strong, tough military without sounding militant, right? Like it's not like blustering,
very unpopular war.
Yes.
So that's
Right.
interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
Right, when we're rethinking the kind of American might and so.
but don't cut our military budgets.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
We still need the big stick.
We still need the stick. That stick costs $700 million to develop, and then we will never actually build it. Want to talk a little bit about some other cliches? I mentioned the buck stops here. Are there any other kind of like vintage presidential lines, especially ones that feel like they've escaped the world of politics?
If there's one I still don't understand that much, it's FDR's the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, which to me, I don't know. Someone has to explain it to me because I'm like, are you saying we only need to be afraid of what? Like, I'm not sure what fear is. It doesn't explain enough for me. Like, I need to know what fear is and then need to know why I don't need to fear. Like, it just doesn't feel clear.
So we don't need to go down this entire rabbit hole, but I think that what he's actually saying is like people being scared is making them make bad choices. And that is what is scrambling the economy right now and what's preventing recovery. And if we can just get out of that headspace, then we have a clear path forward to deal with all the things that are actually really scary.
It's like the inverse of fake it till you make it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Like,
okay. Yeah.
But I also have had that feeling with that quote where I you hear it once and then you're like, oh yeah. And then you think about it a little bit more and you're like, wait a minute. And then you think about it more and then you're like, oh, okay. And so, sorry, this is an aside, but this is one of my favorite things about, there's like a whole world of and it's often like cliches and ideas and ththings people say, but it's like, you either want to underthink it or overthink it. But if you actually just think it, then you're caught in the middle.
So true.
100%.
I think I was overthinking it. I was like, wait a minute, doing the calculations in my head. I totally.
Yeah, that's one that gets you into knots pretty easily. One of the ones that gets thrown out all the time now is from Ronald Reagan, where he said the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Oh, wow.
And I think the reason that it's so sticky is because it captures such a clear difference between the two parties. Is government the problem or is government the solution, right? And we go through phases, but I think that, for the next 20 or 30 years, both parties kind of bought into the idea that the government was the problem. Right. And so I think that's one of the reasons some of these have such staying power is because their presidencies were so successful.
I mean, that is an incredibly powerful and effective line and captures so much. I continue to just be stunned by the fact that that line is used by the person who is asking to be handed the keys to the government, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, how often does that work rhetorically where you're like, I don't believe at all in the thing that we're doing, but I still want to control.
Yeah.
It's like, geez. But anyway, that's another larger question. JFK, think not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I like that. That continues to be effective. It feels like lately some of the lines, actually just before we started taping, we talked about Michelle Obama, you know, when they go high, we go, or when they go low, we go high. And that was tried it out for a while. And now I think people are realizing like, maybe not. Maybe we just say, screw you. You know?
Maybe we just meet them where they're at.
So, you know, these can be malleable and change. But I don't know. It does feel like the Obama stuff that lingers and the Trump stuff that lingers feels much more like less like aphorisms and more like slogans, if that makes sense. Like less like wisdom, you know.
Yeah. And more like yes we can. Yes we can is more like it's like that Rosie Riveter, you can do it kind of thing. Yeah.
But and maybe that's just a symbol of the fact that we're like looking to our leaders a little less for that kind of like universal wisdom.
And it's also like they're broader, emptier containers, right? Like they're not pointing in any particular direction in some ways. Like make America great again. Yes, we can. Like you can fill that with a lot of different content.
Yeah. Yes, we can. What? What can we do?
So there's maybe less meaning in there, but more kind of it's more effective politically because that's right.
Hey, it worked for them both. So.
I guess so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's leave it there. I'm really glad we got to this. And actually, I don't know. Maybe we should circle back on maybe fear itself. If anyone else has an interesting Rorschach interpretation of that one, I'd love to hear it. 'Cause you're right. It is really malleable. But that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.